Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll wait 1 or 2 minutes for others to join so that we have a good registration today. So let's allow others to join meanwhile. Okay, just 1 more minute and then we'll slowly start. Okay, let's slowly start. So thank you all once again. Welcome to the first webinar of ECOSP for this year. Myself, Pushpinder Shekhawat. I work for ENTSO-E from last 4 years and looking into the ECOSP as a product owner on the ENTSO-E side. As part of our continuous effort, every year we uh, schedule some webinars or training sessions, what we can call it, to help all the users who use the ECOSP to bring the latest information related to it and also about the functionality. So in continuation to that, for 2025, we have uh, scheduled 3 webinars so far, and this is the first one. So, and few rules related to the webinar, as we do for all other webinars, it will be recorded and the recording will be updated on our YouTube channel. So in 1 week time, you can review or see this recording from the today's session into the YouTube channel. So it's always helpful for your future references. As it is a webinar, so all the microphones are by default muted. So in case you want to ask any question or be part of the discussion, just raise your hand. I will allow unmute your mic, or you can raise the request in the chat. There will be a Q&A session anyway, and if you have any specific queries related to the topic today, you can request it. Also, as I mentioned, we have webinars plan. So the information for those webinar are already shared on our website. If hopefully most of you are already part of our newsletter, but in case you are not, I would suggest to subscribe to the EcoSP news channel. It's a monthly newsletter where you will get the latest information on EcoSP along with all this kind of all webinar that we are planning as well. So just for a quick reference, this slide provides. So today we are in the session which is about the configuration of EcoSP component happening today, and then followed by the 2 more webinars planned for this year. So the next one will be in September, and then on October. The September one is very specific, bit of for the advanced topic called LDAP authentication as well as the message path. So if you are using LDAP, it might be interested for you, along with the message path, how you can utilize the message path configuration to get more advanced cases. Then in October, we will have another one, which is basically the introduction. It is open to all those who are familiar with the ECCo or those who want to know more about ECCo. By that time, in this October time, we will have another release from ECCo. So that would be the good opportunity to showcase all the things we are doing there. But on high level, we will introduce the basic functionality of ECCo and how to use it. So this is overall, and today I have with me the my colleague from the Unicorn team, who is our partner in the developing the ECCo. They will walk us through the configuration or the today's webinar. So without any further delay, I will hand over now to Unicorn team for start the session. Yeah, Daniel, to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Hello everyone, and welcome once more on today's webinar. This one will be about the configuration of the ECCo. From our side, my name is Daniel Enota. I'm an ECCo analyst for the past few years, and together with me there is Michael.
Hi, my name is Mike Pinkas, and I'm developer for the ECCo team.
And Anna.
And my name is Anna Kavoliak, and I am the ECCo project manager for the last at least 4 years, I think.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah. And regarding today's agenda, we'll go to the ECP endpoint configuration. We will check the configuration files, check the location, and basically the whole configurations that are in there. And then we will also show you where to find all the other properties within the documentation. The same then will apply also for the EDX toolbox and the ECCo Artemis, which will finish the whole ECCo client part. So we can start with the ECP configuration. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we will start with the description of the configuration folders, where you can find configuration files for the ECP endpoint. On the Linux, you can find the configuration main configuration files under the folder etc/ECP endpoint. Logs are located under var log ECP endpoint. The folder varlib ECP endpoint serves pretty much for the data of the endpoint. So you can find by default the embedded database, the DRP database, and also the out key store and key store is placed there. For the user share ECP endpoint, it is for the application files, core application files, and that is the Tomcat that is running the ECP endpoint together with the var file exploded. So as I have, we will start with the main configuration files of the ECP endpoint. That is the folder etc/ECP endpoint. The ECP properties that we will find there contains the main configuration properties. We will go through these quickly in a second. Next, there are other configuration files like the ECP users, which contains the user credentials that you can use in case you are using the default authentication, not the LDAP. Then there is the ECP logback, which serves to configure the logging of the application, and JMX remote properties, which are used to configure the JMX configuration. And then we have the conf env and setenv. These serve to set the environment variables, and these two are located in the slightly different place in the etc/ECP endpoint. No, the system configuration folder, but we will show this. on the server itself. So I will go first to the ECP endpoint configuration folder, where we can see the mentioned configuration files. Going into the ECP properties, here we have the default properties. Starting from the bottom, from the top, we have the active profiles, where we can set the ECP HA, non-AH. We can also disable the authentication using the profile ECP disable user out. Also, we have profiles for LDAP authentication. That would be the ECP-LDAP. For users using Docker or Kubernetes, there is also a profile that will log application logs into the console, which you can find in the configuration, and we will get to that later. Then we have a part where we can configure the data directory. By default, it is the varlib ECP endpoint. And as I said, you can find the key stores there that are used by default, of course, with password being the default password. And then we have the storage root for the messages. Next section, we have the high availability configuration section, where we can find properties that are used to configure the HA setup, mainly the ECP database URL with credentials. Then we have the validation query, which on most databases is select one, but some use the different validation query, which can be found in the administration guide under the chapter for the databases. And then we have the local instance ID, which needs to be unique across the high availability cluster. Good thing to mention is that you need to enable the ECP HA profile in this property. Next, we have the internal broker configuration. Going to the default properties, use authentication enables the AMQPS protocol together with the credentials. Then we have the credentials themselves. Then we have the key store location that is used to connect to the internal broker. By default, it is the same out key store that we can find in the property above in the ECP out key store location. Then we have the password for the key store and the certificate, and the alias that should be used to authenticate to the internal broker. Next, we have two properties that were added recently. That is the Q prefix and business application Q prefix. The Q prefix can be used in case you are running a single internal broker for multiple instances of ECP endpoints, but not to confuse, it is meant that the ECP endpoints are registered as separate instances, that they are not running in a high availability setup. The business application queue prefix is used for the business application queues, that is the inbox, outbox, the queue for the acknowledgements. And it can be different from the queue prefix. Next, we have properties for logging. We can see the default path varlog ECP endpoint here, with the default name for the logs being ECP log. And in the ECP logback configuration, we will find options to further customize this. By default, the ECP log will be, there will be maximum of 7 files with the dot and index of the file, and they are being gun zipped, so they don't take as much space. Next, we can see the logging level org Apache Cupid configuration parameter, which basically tells us that for logging level, for this package, we will use only the warning level. This way you can, this property you can use to either suppress warning logs or pretty much any logs that you don't want to see by increasing the logging severity, or you can decrease the severity to, let's say, debug or trace log in case you are troubleshooting some issues. For the ECP and EDX applications, the namespace we are using is eu.entso-e.ecp or EDX. This can be found in the documentation. Going to the end of the configuration file, we can see that by default, the JMX protocol is disabled. You can enable it here. Also, together, you should configure it in the JMX properties file that we will see in a minute. Next, we have the ECP-DB key store password that is used for the key stores, and certificates that are stored inside the database. Pretty much what the ECP endpoint is doing is that it is storing all the certificates inside the database using this password, and then it is exporting these certificates inside the ECP key store or out key store using this password. This is file-based location, and this is used for the database location. Next, we have the management endpoints that are from Spring Boot provided. That is, for example, the info, health, or readiness. However, you can also enable an endpoint for Prometheus. Next, we have the health show details with always. That is to, by default, the health endpoint displays only the status being up or down. With this property enabled, you can also see which part is down. That could be the disk space on the server, or in case of specific things related to the ECP endpoint not being able to connect to its internal broker or not being able to synchronize. This is quick and easy check that you can do to see if everything is running all good. Next to it, we have the readiness, which tells us the similar informations like the endpoint being connected to the internal program, having issues with synchronization with the component directory, and so on. This readiness also enables the readiness dashboard dialog, which you can see on the GUI in the bottom right corner. And last property that we can see here is the ECP CSRFF secret, which is used to encrypt, or rather hash, the CSSRF tokens that are used in the browser for the cross-site request forgery protection. This would be everything from the default ECP properties. Next, we can go to the ECP users, where we can see the default credentials, being the admin with password, and role admin. In case you want to add more users, you would copy this section, increase the index here to next available integer, that would be 1, and you can set your own users here. The roles we have is the admin and user. Admin has extra privileges that can access the settings on the GUI for the ECP endpoint. The user, regular user, can send messages but cannot configure things like message paths or the contact information. Next, we will go through the ECP logback, which is the logback configuration file where you can configure the logging. What we can do here is we can see what I didn't mention previously, that we have also an ECP audit profile. In the profiles, you can also enable audit logging profile, which will make the logging of regular log files and audit logs set in separate files. So the regular logging logs will end up in the ECP log, and the audit logs will end up in the ECP audit log. Going back to the logback, it is pretty much the regular logback configuration with properties, their name, and then we have the value. Normally, you don't need to bother with these properties. We can see that the ECP audit is the default file name for the ECP audits, in case you have the audit log profile enabled. But what might be more interesting that we have the logback rolling policies here. That is that the maximum size of the log will be 50 megabytes. There will be maximum of 7 files in the history. That is the ECP logs with the indexes at the end. And that the total maximum size of all the logs, that is the 7 logs, will be 70 megabytes. Next, we have the Spring. We have profiles for the different logging methods. As I said, we have the ECP audit that you can enable. This will make the audit logs in its own file. Going down, then we have ECP in memory, which logs into the console, which you will probably not use. But this is the default one. That is that the logs are going into the ECP log, and that is the regular logs and the audit logs, and that's it. Normally, you will not edit anything in these files, but it is sometimes nice to further optimize your logging. Next, we will go into the GMX remote properties, which I mentioned. These are to enable the GMX protocol, and here we can see that by default these properties are commented out and not used, but you can use these properties to set the default port for the GMX together with the path to the GMX remote password. Here you would put the GMX remote password together with the access file if you want to use the registry SSL, and also the SSL config file, which in our case is the same file. And you can see the SSL configuration parameters here with no default pretty much being set, but you should use your own custom key stores anyway. Key stores and trust stores. Next, we have the configure password script, which is used to configure passwords on your ECP endpoint when you install it. That is when the ECP endpoint has its default configuration. This script pretty much replaces the default passwords with the password you choose. You can choose between the passwords that are hashed, plain text, or encrypted, and you can also set different passwords for the users, for the key stores, and everything containing the passwords. So going back to the presentation, we have gone through these first 4 files, and now we will go to the conf.env and setenv. As I mentioned, these are used for the configuration of environment variables. That would be for example, the maximum limit of memory that the endpoint can use. And you can find these under the, I believe, user share ECP endpoint, going into the bind folder, that is the Tomcat folder. We will go through this in more detail later. And here we can see the setenv file. And when we go into it, we can see, as I mentioned, the properties to limit the maximum memory usage of the Java process. Next, we have the Catalina home and base. That is pretty much the folder that we are located in. In most cases, you will, once again, don't modify these properties. However, regarding the Java options, these are nice to know where they are located and to set up for the best performance. Also, we can find that the path for the dump file in case the memory limit is reached and the Java process creates the dump file. Next, we have the location of the ECP properties in case you would want to have multiple files where you configure the ECP endpoint due to security or anything. You can set these here, separated by the comma. Next, we have the etc and ECP endpoint TCP password file. This file is used in case you are using encryption of passwords using this YASIPT. This is the default path. You have to create this password. You have to create this file, and it will contain the YASIPT password. This is, of course, covered in the documentation. And next and last, we have the GMX remote properties in case you want to change the location of it. Pretty much same structure of this file is also for the conf, which I should also mention that the setenv file is used in case you are not using the systemctl service on the Linux. In case you are using the service, you can go into the etc folder, into the systemd, the system, the ECP endpoint service, and here we can see the endpoint file, which is the same file as we could find in the setenv. However, this file is used by the service. So the ECP endpoint properties, we have gone through these, and we have described these pretty much these properties. You can find them. In case you would change anything in these properties, in all of these files, the ECP endpoint must be restarted. Therefore, you have other option to configure the ECP endpoint. Going into the GUI, you can go to the settings page if you have the admin role, and going into the bottom of the page, we can see runtime configuration. This configuration you can edit using two options, preferably using the GUI. Using the edit configuration button, you will be redirected to this page where you can find properties that you can modify in the runtime of the endpoint. And these do not require restart of the ECP endpoint service. However, context route is performed, which takes also some time, so it is not fully without downtime, but it is shorter period of time than if you are restarting the whole ECP endpoint. What could be good to mention, in case, let's say we would like to enable the ECP endpoint IMQP API, you can do this both in the ECP properties or here, but once you do it in the properties file, you will not find the property here and you cannot modify it. it will have to be modified in the ECP properties. Once you edit some properties, you will just hit the save button and the endpoint will reload its configuration of the context. The other option you have is to export the configuration into a file, which the browser will automatically download. And here you can see the same properties as in the GUI, however, they are commented out and are visible in the properties file if you prefer working with the properties in file-based. We can see, for example, the home component directory primary URL being here. Yeah. So now we have covered the default properties. It will be nice to also go through the documentation, specifically the ECP administration guide for the ECP endpoint. If we will scroll down to the chapters, we will find the ECP endpoint administration under the chapter number 5. Quick notice: we are using the latest ECP 4.16 documentation, which might differ for lower versions. I will not go through all the properties covered in the ECP documentation. However, going at least through the chapters, you can find many options, like how you can enable the authentication, how you can hash the password, how you can enable separate authentication for the web services, or rather disable it, how you can also enable the authentication using LDAP, and so on. Next, we have the message paths, FSSF, pretty much all the channels, archiving of the messages, that is when you receive them, endpoint can duplicate the messages and store them on the file system for you in case you need archivation. Next, you will find information about send and receive handlers. These are special handlers that you can configure and program yourself and can bring a little bit of the business application logic to the endpoint itself. You can, for example, change the file names of the files for the file system and so on. Next, we have message expiration, that is 14 days by default. Message priority, that is the priority the endpoint will treat the messages only on its side. This priority is not being distributed in across the ECP network. This is mainly for your endpoint only. You can set up message types and different priorities for the message types. So next we have the logging, that is the logback file, the logging properties file, and logging properties themselves into ECP properties. That is to set up the logging severity, to info warning, debug, error logs, also the location for the logs, rotation, that is the default value of being the 7 files maximum and the size of them. Next, we have the HTTPS configuration for the Tomcat. That is the Tomcat configuration to set up the HTTPS protocol for the GUI. In case of EDX, also for the interface. Next, we have chapters how to enable the proxy, how to add plugins to ECP. That would be the receive handlers, send handlers, direct communication, which is not used in most of the networks. That is the communication of 2 ECP endpoints without the ECP broker. Next, we have the message deleting. That is the retention for how long the messages will be displayed in the GUI. Also, how long the messages will stay in accepted status, that is that the message was sent but never received by the receiver. Then it is moved into the failed status and then deleted. Per chapter for the synchronization with corporate directory, that is the interval, how often the endpoint should synchronize. By default, it should be 5 minutes, but you can set up more frequent synchronization. Next, we have message signing. In most use cases, the default message signing is used using the default ECP endpoint signing certificate. Next, we have properties for nothing. So in case you are having ECP directory and ECP endpoint in the same internet network, you will have the component directory set up to use the public IP address, that is the internet public ID address. Using the NAT properties, you can set the endpoint to contact the component directory directly using the local subnet address that you have in your network, so you don't have to expose the endpoint to the internet. That is also for the ECP broker. But this relates mainly to the TSOs having the component directory and broker installed in the same network. Next, we have the antivirus, Eulogia access, JMX properties. Next interesting chapter would be the 5.24, the external database configuration. That would be for the high availability setup and the configurations for the supported databases, that is the MySQL. In case you don't want to use the file-based database by default, you can set up MySQL, MSQL, database, Postgre, or Oracle database. Other configuration settings is, for example, connectivity check. That is not mainly the configuration, but you can use, you can perform connectivity check to other endpoints in the GUI, or using the SOAP protocol and the web services. You can set up message compression, JMS address validations, message table compression job, that is mainly for the Postgre and the Derby database, which need the compression for the message table. Also, how to configure the connection URL parameters for the ECP brokers. That is in case this is used for the ECP endpoint connecting to the ECP broker. You might want to modify the default JMS properties, so the endpoint prefetches, let's say, only a single message in, and not the default value of being 1000. Next, we have chapters how to renew the certificates. That is done automatically on ECP endpoint and component directory. However, on the endpoint, you can do it also manually through the GUI. And for the ECP broker, you have to do it manually. Next, we have the backup and restore, data and configuration. In this chapter, we cover the most important files that you should backup. That is the ECP properties, data from the database, the key stores, and so on, for both Windows and Linux configuration installations. Next, we have cluster logs. In case the ECP endpoint is running in a cluster of multiple endpoints, that is for how long the endpoint will log its master status on the endpoint or ECP and EDX. Messages are processed by all of the nodes in the cluster. However, we still have the master and slave that is used for the background jobs. Some background jobs are running only on the master node. That is, for example, the compression jobs. Next, we have chapter how to change the IP address on the server, how to revoke the component in case you need to revoke the endpoint, it is no longer being used. And next we have the chapter for multiple endpoints with one internal broker. This relates to the properties for the queue prefixes that you need to set up. So that would be everything for the ECP endpoint, and now is the time for your questions.
Yeah, if you have any question, please raise your hand or put it in the chat and the Q&A section also.
Yeah, maybe in the meantime, I can add some additional information actually for the runtime configuration, and it's the fact that the configuration is stored within the database, which has a lot of advantages. For example, you can then freely just reinstall the ECP component, and basically, if you're using the external database or you have the DB folder in case of their database somewhere backed up, you can then just reuse it, and you basically won't lose key runtime configuration in that case. Also, the fact that it is stored in the database means that the configuration from the runtime configuration is prioritized over the system configuration. So, as Michael mentioned, like if you have some property defined in the system configuration, the ECP.properties, it won't be visible in the runtime configuration. But if you do it the opposite way, that you firstly define something in the runtime configuration and then in the system configuration, the runtime one will be prioritized and used.
We have some questions in the chat.
That's a long exception.
Yeah, if it is very specific, I would suggest to take it separately, but yeah, and then other questions are also there related to. Yeah.
Just quickly for the question from Tomáš. The solution in case of the newer versions, the one with Artemis, is actually a bit easier. You don't need to copy the certificates from ECP to EDX because the Artemis uses a completely different one, so you can use separate certificate for that.
That is the version ECP 4.14 and higher.
Yes.
In case of EDX, same numbers.
Yes.
Then we have some question from Miguel.
Okay, regarding the integration of channels for ECP, if you are using web services, is it possible to know which files has been sent and query them using web services? Not for the already sent messages. You can, if you know the message ID, which is provided to you during the sending of the message, you can then send the check message status request. This will tell you the current status of the message, but I don't think there is any request that would give you all the message type or all the messages that ECP currently has. You would need to use the graphic user interface for that. And another question from Tomáš, what is required to copy when I want to migrate from one instance to another? Well, mainly the database. If you're using Derby database, the location is the var lib ECP endpoint and the DB folder. Then additionally, you can also the key source. However, the ECP endpoint will pull the certificates from the database and create the key source during the startup. So that's kind of optional, but it's always better to do so. And then basically all the files that you have changed. So if you changed something in the ECP.properties, it would be great to migrate that as well as some other potential configuration files. For example, if you updated the ECP logback XML, made some changes, you would need to also migrate that as well. But for keeping the registration, the database mainly is the main thing you want to migrate.
Also regarding the migration of the database, in the recent versions, I believe 4.14 and 1.13, we have added the option to export the database from the GUI. That is below the runtime configuration. You can create a backup of the database and you can just import it on the destination.
Yes,
so you don't need to copy the DB folder or migrate the database itself.
Yeah. The only thing is that the already sent and received messages, well, actually all the messages won't be backed up, so you will technically lose those, but yeah.
And also for the files, obviously, the files in the ECP endpoint folder, but in case you would modify the configuration files for the Tomcat, these are easy to forget. That is, for example, the server XML, which has the HTTPS configuration. You also need to take that.
Yeah, and I think that were all the questions so far.
Yeah.
We got a thumb up from Tomas.
Another one we can check, but sorry for that. That was too AC. We will check that in the meantime, but I'm not sure if we will be able to deliver the answer during the webinar.
This would be the default HTTPS connector of the server XML. You might change, including the default out key store.
And it's password. That's also another thing that is easy to forget. If you changing the passwords manually, you need to change it here as well. However, for those purposes, we have the configure password.sh script in the etc/ECP endpoint directory. So you can use that.
So in case there are no more questions, we will move on to the configuration of the EDX toolbox. So once again, for the default configuration folders, they are on the Linux, they are pretty much the same as on the ECP endpoint. We have the main configuration files under the ETC folder in the EDX toolbox folder, varlib for the key stores embedded database data, varlog for the log files, and user share EDX toolbox for the core application files. That is the Tomcat. So going to we will once again go through the properties with one exception, or rather one extra file that is for the EDX toolbox, being the EDXML, which is used to configure the integration channels and extra processing. We will see that in the folder in a second. So I will once again go to the ETC, EDX toolbox folder, where is the main configuration file, EDX properties. The structure is properties that we can find here are similar to the ECP endpoint, but there are some differences. Starting with the first line, first property is the EDX toolbox code. As EDX toolbox is using the component code from the ECP endpoint, You have to set up the component code here. That would be the component code of the ECP endpoint. Next, we have the service catalog code. That is the catalog code of the home catalog for the EDX toolbox. Once again, that is the code of the ECP endpoint of that catalog, of course. Next, we have the EDX toolbox node ID, which serves the same purpose as on the ECP, serves the local instance ID property. This is to differentiate between the instances in the high availability cluster. That is for the locking in the database of the master status, but also for the DMS folders, full DMS folders, which we will go through in a second. Next section, we have the filtering of message duplicities. Here we can enable or disable this. By default, it is disabled. And we can set up message types for which the duplicity check should be performed. Next, we have a URL that is used for the pull messages. Here we have the default internet network and an example for the URL that one would use. However, you should use public IP address. That means that there will be not localhost, but probably the IP address of the server and the port of the EDX toolbox. In case the toolbox is running on its own server, it can be 844.3, but in case it is running on the same server as the ECP endpoint, you need to change this port to something different. Commonly, this is changed to port 9443. This is covered in the documentation, and we will show how to configure this. Next, we have a property for the automatic pull message types. That is by default, the toolbox does not pull the messages automatically. You have to set up the message types that should be pulled automatically. Here we have the example how to set it up, and also by default we have the asterisk, which tells us that all the message types will be pulled automatically. Next, we have the nothing property that is set to false by default. That is same as on the ECP endpoint. However, the endpoint configuration does not have the property mentioned here by default. That does not mean that the nothing is enabled. It's just that the property is not shown with the default value. Next, we have the configuration for the pull messaging, specifically for the folder where you would put the messages, that is the content of the pull message. As you might know, in case of pull messaging, you are sending a notification document that points to this location, which contains the content of the message, not by default. In case this is not configured, Java temporary directory is used for the folder, and that is not the Linux temporary folder, that is the Tomcat temporary folder. So it is located under the user share EDX toolbox folder together with the Tomcat itself. Of course, we have both properties for out and in for setting where you store the messages that will be sent, and where the toolbox is storing the messages that were received for both automatic and manual tool. Next, we have a retry job delay of being default with default value of 2 minutes. That is how quickly the toolbox tries to pull the message in case it fails. Next, we have the expiration jobs. That is the time for how long the message will be available on the toolbox. If you send the message, the receiver will be able to pull the message for the next 24 hours from being sent. And for the expiration job itself, that it is running every minute. Next, we have the trust store location and password for the pull interface. By default, we are using the out key store. Well, by default, it is commented out, and SSL is not used. But in case you would use the HTTPS protocol and the SSL for pull messaging, you need to specify a key store, which should be known by both sender and receiver. And by default, in case you are not using external pull interface, the key store should be the same as for the HTTPS connector. That is the connector that is configured in the server XML for the Tomcat. Next property for the pull messaging is slicing enabled. That is being false by default. This is property for embedded pull, and that is pull messaging where you are not using pull interfaces and the messages are directly sent through the ECP network. In case slicing is enabled, you can slice the content to small slices, so you can send messages larger than 30 megabytes. Next, we have the deleting job on the toolbox. That is the job that is mainly deleting jobs, deleting messages that you can see in the message box. And by default, it will delete messages older than 1 week. And the job is running every minute. This is regarding, it will delete the messages in the final state. Next, we have the property and section for the cluster of toolboxes. That is how often the DX toolbox and the HA cluster will renew its master status, by default being 5 seconds, which should be fine in most of the environments. Next, we have section that relates to the DMS folders. So the DMS storage is basically where the toolbox stores the message content during its processing. So it is not sending it through the internal broker queues to optimize performance. Once again, by default, it is in the Java temporary directory. That is the Tomcat temporary directory, not to confuse with the Linux temporary directory in the EDX DMS. I will skip a little bit. You can also find the pull DMS storage here, and that is for the pull messages. And once again, with the same default, however, with inside the EDX pull DMS folder, and you can differentiate, should be different folders for both of these DMSs. Next, we have the storage ID that is using the property from above, the toolbox node ID, that is to differentiate the nodes in the cluster. This will be appended to the path here. So here, so the toolbox knows about its own files. And also, what should be mentioned for the HA deployment, the DMS folders must be shared between the nodes, most likely using the NFS protocol. Next, we have configuration for the directories themselves. Max files property that tells us there will be maximum of 10,000 files in a single directory, maximum of 10,000 directories, and cache validity duration in minutes, half an hour by default. The cache is used so during the messaging you are not accessing the file system, which would be slow operation for changes in the storages. Of course, the limit here is once again performance, so the server doesn't struggle with hundreds of thousands of messages in single directory. For the pool DMS, we have already mentioned this property. This is the same for both pool DMS and DMS. You can once again configure these properties. Same configuration as for the DMS, but with the addition of the pool prefix here. Next, we have the embedded database configuration. Also the high availability database configuration. On the ECP endpoint, we did not see these properties explicitly configured, but on the toolbox we can see them. By default, the Derby is used, same as on the endpoint, but we can see it here specifically. That is the username and password with the validation query and test on borrow. In case of high availability setup, we would modify these chain properties to not be the JDBC Derby connector, but it might be the MySQL, MariaDB, MSSQL, JDBC connectors. You will find these in the documentation as well. Slightly hidden data directory property that is used to configure the Barley PDX toolbox, that is used to store the database itself, the file-based database, and the key stores. These are regular Spring properties, which means that you can reuse these properties on other places in the configuration and just to refer to them, which should make the configuration easier. We could see that for the key stores that you are not always specifying the Barley PDX toolbox path, but instead you are using the property name that is configured here. You can also use your own custom properties for the configuration, as long as you are not duplicating the properties from EDX toolbox, of course. Next, we have the Spring properties for the Tomcat and the Spring Servlet. That is the maximum file size you can upload to the GUI, by default being 50 megabytes. Next, Servlet, these properties, in most cases, we will not ever use. But property that you will use is the once again Spring profiles active, that is used to configure the profiles by default only the non-HH profile, but in case of EDX-HA without the none, we will configure the toolbox to run in the high available setup. You can also provide profiles, names for the TCP LDAP to disable authentication or disable the authentication only on the web service. All of the profiles are covered in the documentation, of course. Next, once again, we have the JMX enabled being false by default. Next, slightly more interesting chapter now is the internal broker configuration. From the version ECP 4.14 and 1.14, ECP endpoint and EDX toolbox are not using the embedded ActiveMQ classic broker, but instead we are distributing instance of ActiveMQ Artemis. This is on a separate service. So we will need to configure both endpoint and toolbox to configure to that internal broker. This provides you an option to use single internal broker for both endpoint and toolbox. Going through these properties, they are the same as on the endpoint. We will use this to enable the MQPS protocol, the credentials that are used to connect to the internal broker. However, the default installation of the ECCo Artemis is using credentials endpoint password. So the toolbox password will by default work, and you have to configure the user accordingly to the configuration in the Artemis broker, which we will go through in the end of this webinar. Next, we have the key store. As already mentioned, if we are using the Artemis, you will use the same key store on the endpoint and toolbox and ECCo Artemis, which means that you don't need to copy the key store from endpoint to toolbox. Next, we have the password for the key store and the alias. Make sure that this alias is present in the key store. By default, you can use the default key store to connect to the Artemis broker, to the internal broker, and the default EDX toolbox key store contains the EDX module out. The default ECP key store will contain ECP module out. Next, we have the properties to set up the host and port, which can be either done in these properties, or you can directly use the EDX broker URL, where you can see that these properties are being referenced. So you can either use these properties or replace this connection string with your own URL. Once again, the key prefixes. These are pretty much the same as on the ECP endpoint. You don't need to worry about them that much. But in the next section, the ECP broker section, this section relates directly to the internal broker of the ECP endpoint. As mentioned, you can have same Artemis internal broker instance for both endpoint and broker. That means that that these properties will have the same value here and here. But what you should pay attention to is the ECP broker key prefix. This is the key prefix used by the ECP endpoint. So you need to make sure that the ECP broker key prefix has the same value as the key prefix configured on the ECP endpoint, specifically the property internal broker VA key prefix. Next, for the ECP internal broker, we have the receive, send, and acknowledgements queues. which are used by the toolbox to connect to on the endpoint. These are the queues we call the business application queues. Basically, these are the queues. And when you enable the IQP API on the endpoint, these queues will be exposed. Next, we have the login configuration, where we can once again set up the path to the folder where the logs will be contained, the default file name, that is the EDX log. Next, we have the EDX logback configuration. Next, we have logging levels that are specifically configured. That is for the EU Unicorn EDX. That is the default namespace for most of the packages inside the Java application. That is the info. For the AE package, that is the error. And for the Apache camel, we are using info. What might be good to mention is that on the ECP endpoint, the namespace is EU.ENTSO-E, and on the EDX, we are using the Unicorn package name. Next, we have commented out section for the trace logging for the FTP. In case you would need that, you can also configure other communication channels here. Same section as on the ECP endpoint for the Spring Boot endpoints, that is the info health readiness. You can also enable, for example, the Hotio or the Prometheus. Purpose is the same as on the endpoint. And the last property that we have is the EDX secret that is used for the cross-site request for Jelly token generation. So yeah, that is the EDX properties. EDX users quickly is the same as on the ECP endpoint. However, instead of the administrator role, we have the service manager. And the user role is the same.
Yeah, it's just user.
Just the admin is the service manager. So once again, if you want to add another user, you would copy this section, increase the index here, and change the credentials and the role. The service manager role once again permits you to access the settings page where you can configure, for example, the time zone. User role can send messages as well on the toolbox. Quickly, the logback configuration is the same as on the ECP endpoint. So once again, we can find the properties for the audit log file, the log file itself, being the EDX audit log, or the audit log, and EDX log. However, since in the EDX properties we have the EDX log, this is not used. Next, we have the rolling policies. Once again, maximum of 7 files. The active log file will have maximum of 50 megabytes, and all of the log files combined will have maximum of 70 megabytes. And then we have the appenders, same as on the endpoint, with the console logging profiles and audit log profiles as well. What you can also do in logback, what I didn't mention previously, you can set up your own logging pattern in case you would want to use different format for the timestamp, for example, or any other structure change. Once again, configure the password script that will configure the passwords for you with the options of being plain text, hash, or encrypted. And JMX properties file, that is the same file as on the ECP endpoint where you can configure the JMX. The configuration here is the same. An extra file on the EDX toolbox is the EDX YAML, which is used to configure integration channels. Main structure of this file is it is an YAML configuration where we will start with the key integration channels, and below it we will find sections for the endpoints. First being the MQP endpoints. Here we can define the views that can be used by the business application. By default, we can see the EDX endpoint outbox and inbox. One used for the sending of the messages, one for the receiving. You can also set the delivery attempts here in case the message processing fails. Also the delay between the attempts. Going down, next we will find the FTP endpoints, that is for the FTP integration channel. The configuration here will differ from the MQP endpoints. Main part is the direction. This tells us if the endpoint is being used for the sending or receiving messages. The protocol that should be used, that can be the FTP or the FTPT, the trivial, or FTPS. Host name, port where the FTP is running, the name of the file directory where the messages will be located. Next, the reply directory, that's for the acknowledgements. And of course, the credentials. Next part is the code. This is also same for all the endpoints. The code will be referred to in the routing section itself. We will see that down below in a while. And connection parameters that are FTP specific parameters. For example, the Unix separator, if the slash should be forward or backwards. Next, we have the FSSF endpoint, that is the local file system. Once again, we can see the direction and the code, and directory where the files will be located. Once again, one endpoint for sending messages and one for receiving messages. You will also have the option to configure not only the directory for the receiving of messages, but also the error directory and logging directory. All of this is mentioned in more detail in the administration guide or user guide. Next, we have the Kafka endpoints. Kafka endpoints configuration similar to the MQP endpoint. And next, so we have the web service, which you don't need to define endpoints for, as it is the default channel that is used by the toolbox to route messages to. Next section in the YAML configuration file is components. We have 3 types of components, that is the validations, transformations, and external processing. These are used well basically for what it says. You can use the validations, processing steps for the validation of the incoming XML files. The validation will be performed by an XSD file that you will provide. So you can provide your own custom file to validate the files and messages. Next, we have the transformation, that is the XSLT transformation. Once again, we will provide the file and the message will be transformed using this transformation. In case the message cannot be transformed, it will be not modified and will be passed to the next processing step. It will not fail. And last option you have is the external processing. External processing means that the EDX toolbox will put the message into new internal broker queue where you can access this message and do your own custom transformations and processing. So you will have access to the whole message. After your processing, you will put it back to the other queue, the out queue. Until you do that, the message processing will not proceed. And the last section is the routing section, which by default does not contain any routes, but in the routes, you will set up the integration channels themselves. Here we can see an example for an FSF, integration channel. This route tells us that for the message type A, it will process all message types, all the messages with this message type. The start must be in the toolbox gateway, and the messages will end up in this endpoint. That is the FSSF endpoint. We have configured. You could configure above. This is where the final message will be. Next, you can have another endpoint where the failed messages will be located. Here it is the same one, but you can specify more FSSF endpoints, one for receiving of the messages, one for the failed messages. This is for the receiving, and you can see that it is that these FSSF endpoint 2, this is the code of the endpoint from above. So if I go, for example, the Kafka endpoint, we can see that it has the my Kafka in endpoint code. So this is the code you will use to refer to in the routing section. Here, either in the end or in the start section. This is the pretty much simple route, but in case you would be using the transformation steps, the external processing steps, or the validation steps, you would enrich the section here for the route inside the steps, key. You can reuse these processing steps across multiple routes. And on the end of this file, we can see the default routes. That would be the default send and receive route. Here we can see that for the sending, all of the messages will end up in the toolbox gateway. That is the gateway. The toolbox gateway pretty much refers to the gateway between endpoint and toolbox. In this context of the sending messages, if it is the end, it will be that it will send the message to the endpoint. And in case of receiving, that is the start, the toolbox gateway pretty much means that any received message from the endpoint. So this is everything for the EDX demo. Quite exhausting configuration. Going back to the presentation, just to sum up, we have went through these 5 properties file. And then we have once again the conf.env and setenv. The conf.env can be found in the systemd folder for the EDX toolbox process. It is the same as on the ECP endpoint with slightly different lines here. So the start is same. We have the Catalina home and base. That is the location where the Tomcat and Catalina is based. Next, we have the option to set up the maximum memory limit, same as on the endpoint. However, on the toolbox, it is just 2 GB. Next, we have the property which tells us where the Java process will create dump files. Spring property that is used to locate the configuration properties files. Same as on the ECP endpoint, you can specify one of them. Next, we have the YAML directory. It is the default configuration folder of the EDX toolbox, and you can have multiple EDX YAML files. That's the reason why it is directory and it's not the EDX YAML itself. You would differentiate pretty much every file that has the YAML suffix will be considered as the EDX YAML configuration and will be tried to be loaded. So you can have one EDX YAML for just the endpoints, one for rows, or you can split the configuration based on the integration channel. The EDX YAML files will be united, so they are not overriding each other. But very important part is this one, where we can see configuration of the boards. As mentioned, if the EDX toolbox is running on the same server as the ECP endpoint, you will need to modify these. ECP endpoint is using these ports by default, the ports starting with 8. What you will usually do is that on the toolbox you will modify the 8s to 9s. So it will be the 9 for free port for the HTTPS, 9090 for the HTTP, and so on. This is also related to the service catalog and can be found in the documentations, of course. Next, we have the EDX passport location. This is the file where the YASIP encryption password will be located. You have, once again, you have to create this one. You have to create this file yourself and the GMX role properties. So that should be everything from the toolbox configuration files. We have went through the EDX properties in a little bit more detail, at least the default properties. Next, we went through also the EDX YAML file, which, to sum it up, is used to configure the integration channels. Configuration is split into three main sections. First being the integration channels, that is the endpoints, to specify for the FSSF file system, the folders for the MQP to specify the queues, and then the routing, which tells us how the channels, the endpoints will be used in the routing itself. Next, we will go through the documentations briefly. Once again, the EDX administration guide, chapter 6 will be related to the EDX toolbox. The chapters here are similar to the chapters as on the ECP endpoint. Once again, we have the nothing configuration, steps how to configure the internal broker, integration, that is the MQPS, or how to disable it, and how to connect the business application to the internal broker. Next, once again, the antivirus data source, that would be the databases. Deleting job, that is used to pretty much clean the messages table in the database and message box on the GUI. Cluster log to renew the master status on the toolbox. Chapter how to configure unsuccessful login attempts. That is by default, you can have maximum of 3 attempts that fail. Other configuration settings, that is the ECP endpoint, the storage, that are the DMS folders, FSSF folders, and so on. Application itself, logging, read attempts and delay, and some other general configuration settings. What I didn't mention previously in the ECP endpoint documentation, but that is related mainly to the installation guide. Sometimes there are common chapters that are used for all of the components of both catalog and toolbox. That would be the chapters on the end. So here we can see how to configure the LDAP, how to integrate the ELK stack for the monitoring, info health, readiness endpoints. These chapters are common for catalog and toolbox. They are not under the toolbox chapter, but in its own chapters themselves. So we can find much more here. For example, the already mentioned encryption password using the YASIT, and the database backup and restore from the GUI. So this would be everything for the EDX toolbox. And once again, we have time for some questions.
So far, there are none questions, but yeah, let's give it a minute. Also, it's a bit of the user guide. Don't think it's necessary to go through that in much detail because the whole guide is then basically tailored for the EDX toolbox. So basically everything in there is like configuration related or some mechanisms, etc.
Yeah, seems that we don't have any questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't see hand raised or anything. Yeah. No questions so far.
So now we will go to the last step at the last chapter, that is the ECCo Artemis configuration. As mentioned, from the version ECP 4.14 and 1.14 EDX, we are not using the embedded ActiveMQ Classic internal broker, but instead we have our own service for the internal broker, and we are using ActiveMQ Artemis. So to start, once again, with the default folder paths, the ECCo Artemis instance is installed in the OPT folder, OPT ECCo Artemis, and user share ECCo Artemis. What might confuse you, the Artemis itself has a little bit different approach to installations. You have one big folder that is the user share, which contains all the libraries, the jar files, and common installation binaries and so on. And from this folder, you are creating instances. In the ECCo during the installation, we are creating instance in the OPT folder, in the OPT ECCo Artemis. So the OPT instance is lightweight instance of the Artemis from above. And that is in case you would want to run multiple Artemis server instances. In the ECCo this is not used. This comes mainly from the Artemis installation itself. So we will focus mainly on the OPT ECCo Artemis folder, where you will find all the configuration files and files you will change. You will probably not change anything in the user share and don't need to mind that at all. So the OPT, it's OPT folder, the broker instance folder, contains the configuration files themselves, the default ones. However, the configuration there is common for both endpoint and toolbox. It is not strictly configured for one or other. For the specific configuration, you should go to the ETC ECP endpoint or EDX toolbox JMS folder. We will show that once again on the server, so you don't need to worry about it. So I will once again jump right on the server and we will go through the configurations. Going to the ECCo Artemis folder, we can see multiple folders. The binary folder that is contains the binaries to the scripts to start the Artemis. You don't need to mind that. Data folder, which contains the data, the messages themselves, in case they are not stored in the memory of the internal broker. We will get back to that during the in the configuration. Then we have the library folder. Here you can add custom plugins, log folder that is for the cluster, log folder which contains the log files, temporary folder that is the temporary folder of the Artemis, and web folder. What should be mentioned is that we are just reusing the Artemis broker and we are just configuring it to the ECP endpoint or ECCo needs. So most of the configurations are default and you will find in the official documentation of the Artemis broker. Going into the ETC folder, here we will find all of the configuration properties. I will start with the most important one, that is the broker XML. So this file is to configure the broker itself, starting with the name tag. This is the name that will be displayed in the web console. Next, we have the persistence enabled, which is true. This will use the data directory for the messages and is the preferred setting for the ECCo. Next, we have the journal type, that is the async IO, that is for the Linux. On the Windows, it will be an IO. It is the library used to access the file system by the Artemis broker. Next, we have the configuration of data directories. These directories are used for storing the messages in case they are too large to be stored in the memory of the broker. Next, we have the configuration settings for the journal. Journal is pretty much used to track information about the messages by the Artemis broker. We can see it being defined here. The journal is used for the performance tweaking, so you can experiment with properties related to the journal. The main one is the journal buffer timeout. By default, it is 20,000. However, you can run a script provided by the Artemis broker that will calculate the preferable value for the best performance. Also, I will mention these commands in the XML file, starting with the HA sections marked with these commands are used for the high-level stuff. However, I will not go through that in detail. We already had a webinar on this and can be found on the YouTube channel of the ENTSO-E. Next section is the high-level setup section for the connectors of the brokers in the cluster. That would be the IP addresses and port of the master and slave nodes. Next, we have max disk usage. This value is computed from the whole limit on the server. So in case of 100 gigabytes storage on the server, it will be the 90 gigabytes. Next, property that should we pay attention to is the global max size. This is the memory limit used by the broker, almost. As the broker is Java process, you can configure the XMX, which will define the Java process maximum memory limit. This limit is for the queues. It is recommended to be lower than the actual limit of the broker for performance. So the broker can effectively cache and does not have to garbage collect as often. Next, we have prepare the global max messages. That is to limit maximum number of messages in all of the queues. -1 for the unlimited volume. Next, we have acceptors. This is a rather important section where we can find where the internal broker will be running. By default, we can see that it is running on the 0.0.00 address, which basically tells us any IP address of the server. You can access it using the IP address of the server or the local host, running on the port 5672. And by default, the SSL is enabled. Next, we have the default key store and trust stored paths. The ECCo Artemis comes with its own default key store and ECP endpoint and toolbox. Default key stores contain certificates that can connect to this key store, or rather this acceptor. However, it is of course recommended to use your own key store for security reasons. Next, you would configure an acceptor that would be used for the high-level business stuff. Next, high-level business stuff only related section is for the cluster settings. That is the credentials used by the cluster. The cluster connection settings, that is, here you configure which of the nodes will be master, which slave. And HA policies, which pretty much tells us that in case of failure of the master, the slave will take over, but after the master is back up, the master status will be given back to the master status, master node of the cluster. This is different from the ECP and EDX, where we will not specify one node to be mainly the master. Next, we have security settings. This section is used to configure the privileges of the default role IMQ. By default, we will see that we have only the IMQ role, and you can set permissions to that role here. By default, the role has all the permissions, but you can set up extra users and roles for your needs. Next, we have address settings. These settings are used to configure the queues of the internal broker. Under the settings, we have the address setting that will match all the queues. This hash sign is used for all the queues. And we can see that by default, for all the queues, the dead letter queue will be DLQ, expired queue will be expired queue. The difference here is this queue is used in case of exceptions. This queue is used in case that the message expires. Next, we have the max size bytes. This tells us that each queue will have maximum of 100 megabytes. Once again, maximum of messages that can be stored in the queue is unlimited. And next, we have paging settings. That is the page size that will be stored on the file system. The broker will prefer storing the messages inside its memory, but in case the memory is reached, it will page the messages to the file system, to the data folder in the 10 megabyte pages. And next we have the option, not so interesting option, for how long you will see the message counters in the web console for the queues. That is how many messages went through that queue. The addressable policy, that is that in case the memory limit is reached, it will go into the paging state, and auto create delete being set to true or false. The next section, or rather, I will more elaborate on this. This is set for all the queues, but we will see that you can set up these settings per queue. You would mention the name of the queue here, or rather define a new tag with that queue name, and you can say that for the inbox you want more larger size. You can specify that. We will see that in a while. Next, we have the addresses stack, which contains the predefined queues that will be on the broker when you start it up for the first time, the expire queue and DR queue. Next, we have metrics plugin. This plugin is used to expose the metrics to Prometheus, as we can see by the name. And next section is broker plugins. This section is to configure our plugin that is used for the audit logging. Here you can, but you don't need to, set the component code to any value, most likely the component code of the ECP endpoint, and the component type being ECCo Artemis internal broker. In case this internal broker would be used by multiple instances, you don't need to put the component code here. You can put, for example, shared Artemis broker instance. This is mainly used in the logs, only used in the logs, in the audit logs. So it's completely up to you what will you put here. Next configuration file will be the bootstrap XML. This is to configure the web console. By default, we can see under the web binding that the web console will be running only on localhost. So if you want to access the console from a different host, you will probably need to put the IP address of the server here, or the 4 zeros as we could have seen on the IMQPS connector. And next part, we have the metrics var, which exposes the Prometheus metrics. This is related to the configuration from the broker XML. Next, we can also see the configure passwords. Once again, same as on the ECP and EDX. This script is used to configure, to change to default passwords. Yolokia access. This is for the access of the Yolokia operations by default only from the local host. You will set this. You can set this to just asterisk, so you can see the operations on the web console in case you access it. That is also the queues and everything. Next, we can see the default key store, log4j properties, which are used to configure the logging. This is pretty much default configuration of the Artemis broker. However, with the addition of the audit logging, that is our audit logging from our side, that is the ECP audit logs. And the policies set are to be the same as on the ECP endpoint. That is the maximum size of the file, maximum number of files, and the strategy. That is the naming change. The Artemis log will have the appended index after its name. Also, we can see the gunzip here, that the files will be compressed, same as on the ECP endpoint. Logging config. In this file, we will set up the Artemis users properties and roles. This is the default file-based credentials system. You will modify this file in case you want to configure LDAP authentication or disable the configuration at all. To this file, we have the related Artemis users and roles properties. In the users, we can see the default endpoint with the encrypted password being the password by default. But in case the toolbox would be connecting to this broker, it would not. You need to add the toolbox user here. Or the other option is to go to the toolbox configuration and change it to toolbox user to the endpoint user. Artemis roles, here we can see the MQ role that was configured in the broker XML for the permissions. We can see that just the endpoint user is assigned to this role. In case you create an extra user in the Artemis users, you need to add the user to this list as well. It is comma-separated list. In the Artemis profile, you will not change much of the configuration, but you can see the maximum Java memory limit be configured here. So it is 4 gigabytes, and in the broker XML file, we could see that the configuration for the queues was maximum of 800 megabytes only. That is due to performance reasons. For the management, once again, it relates to the security and permissions of the MQ role. But that's important. Going into the LDAP folder, or Active Directory folder, we can see default configuration files that you would use to configure the LDAP. So you can just grab these files and copy them to the main ETC folder, just to make things a little easier. Going to the ECP endpoint/JMS folder. For the JKS authentication, we can see the broker and Bootstrap XML. These files are the Artemis broker configuration files, but these are specific to the ECP endpoint. So to see the difference, pretty easily. We can see that you can specify, for example, address setting for the download queue, and it will have maximum size of 150 megabytes. Otherwise, it would be just the 100 megabytes that is defined in the section for all of the views. To use this configuration, you need to copy this file to the Artemis broker. But it is here prepared in case you would like to use it or get inspired. This is same for the EDX toolbox. You will also find the JMS folder broker XML. And going, for example, to the address settings, you will find, for example, the EDX internal having maximum of 5 megabytes. Going back to presentation, we have covered these configuration files. These are the main configuration files for the Artemis broker that you will ever need, probably. As mentioned, the broker XML is the main configuration where most of the properties are located. Once again, we can go into the documentation. For the Artemis, there is no EDX documentation. Everything is under the ECP installation guide or the ECP administration guide. And going, for example, into the installation guide, we can go to the chapter 7, internal broker installation. And here we could find a chapter that will tell us how to configure some of these properties. For example, the script Artemis perf journal will tell us the ideal value for the performance. That is the value of 20,000 being the default. But going down, we can also find options to configure SSL and so on. Next, we have the ECP administration guide in the chapter 6. We will find most of the configurations. That is to cover, just go through them quickly. That is how to enable the HTTPS protocol for the web console. History configuration, that is in case you don't want to use the default one. Once again, the GMX protocol, how to enable and use password encryption. It is possible to encrypt values inside the broker XML and hash the values inside the users. The Artemis users properties, where you have the password defined for the users. User management itself with the LDAP authentication. This pretty much describes how to copy the files from the LDAP folder and what needs to be changed. In case you will be using direct communication, there are also changes that has to be made on the endpoint and internal broker. Then chapters how to connect to the internal broker by the business application. Which might be good to mention that in case someone mentions that it is connecting the business application to toolbox or endpoint, it is not connecting to the endpoint or toolbox directly, but connecting to the internal broker. Next, we have how to disable the MQPS protocol and authentication. Of course, not recommended, but for some testing purposes might be relevant. Plugin properties. We have seen the audit logger plugin. Here we have the properties described, the ones that I've talked about, that you don't need the component code to be the exact component code used by the ECP endpoint. Next, we have user credentials for the plugins and how to backup and restore the configuration. We have gone through these files, but the Bootstrap XML and YOLO key access, as mentioned, are used to configure the access to the web console. by default, only access from the local host is configured. In case we want to access it from a different place, we would put the IP address of the server or the 4 zeros. In the Artemis users and rows, we would configure the user credentials together with the LDAP configuration that you can just copy the files from there. Next, we had the documentation chapters. And what needs to be mentioned, in our documentation, the ECP installation or administration guides, we have only chapters related directly to the ECCo components, and the official ActiveMQ Artemis documentation can be used to configure the program in detail. In our documentation, we do not describe, for example, the address settings that we have gone through multiple times. We are not saying, describing all the properties that you can put there. These will be found on the official, in the official documentation. Just make sure that the documentation you are using is either latest or the version of the Artemis matches it. So yeah, that will be everything for the Artemis broker. And once again, you can have some questions.
Yeah, we got one regarding the, I guess, suppose ECP integration channels. Could you just bring the ECP endpoint and its runtime configuration back?
Do we?
Yeah. Thank you. So the question is, I will split it to two parts to have it a bit easier. We exported the configuration from ECP GUI. The exported configuration is corresponding to the file name and the file name. Parameter ECP endpoint MQP API enabled exists and is assigned to true. We would like to know how to download files using FSSF and using web services. This is actually quite not a typical setup, but still pretty simple to configure. And basically, all you need to do once you enable the MQP API enabled property, you will you will enable the API, and it will automatically receive all the messages. To do so, and leave some messages for the FSF and the web service, you will need to specify the message types that will be eventually downloaded and received by the MQP, which you can do by basically this message type property. I think you'll have to also define the incoming queue. So as this name, you can just use the ECP endpoint.inbox or something like that, and then you can specify the various message types that you want to use. You can also use the asterisk, but not just the asterisk. Yeah, the incoming queue, but for the FSF, I will get to that. So once you set these properties, basically all the messages with message type 1 and EDX something will be sent to the ECP.endpoint.inbox. The rest will remain in a delivered state, waiting basically for the reception by the web service.
Or in the GUI.
Or in the GUI, yes. Additionally to this, you can configure the FSF. So scroll down and yeah, you can configure the FSF. Again, we will skip the error, outgoing, etc. It will be necessary for the configuration, but for this, let's say explanation, we are interested into the incoming directory, which will point to the path where the files will be downloaded to. And again, you will need to specify the message types. Again, in this case, if you wanna use the web service as well as the MQP and FSF channel, it would be better to just use some specific message types or the asterisk path with some, say, text prefix. Yes, so like this. So all the not message type 1, ECP, FSZ, and MSG dash, and then after that will be received to the incoming directory specified in the incoming directory property. And for the rest of the message type that can occur, that can be received by the ECP endpoint, the web service can be used, or as Mike mentioned, can be downloaded from GUI. But in your case specifically, the web service will be the channel probably interesting the most. So yeah, so this way you can filter all the messages to different integration channels. And for the second part of your question, if this parameter is assigned to true, where is it possible to know if a third party is sending a file where it's downloaded in the file system? I guess basically asking if the ECP will tell you that there's some new message in the incoming directory. The simple answer is no. You would need to scan it by your business application or have some other mechanism that would periodically pull all the files from the incoming directory.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for the clear explanations, because sometimes we don't know what is the meaning of each of these parameters. I think so the explanation is clear, but I would like to know in the case that we are sending a package of files, it is possible to query to the system which files has been sent in terms of there is any kind of exposed method in the web services to know which files has been sent in order for monitoring purposes and doing that kind of things.
You can use the REST API for these purposes. You can basically send the request to the ECP GUI, and it should like respond with basically the message box that you can also see in the GUI on the ECP endpoint. I'm not sure if there is like any other option how to pull like all the messages from it.
Our idea is to, how to say, as long we have sent to monitor in terms of, how to say, if it is correctly received, it is this kind of things, no, to store in our monitoring system that the file is properly sent and properly received for the ending part of the supply chain. Let me say.
Yeah, this also depends on the integrational channel. For the MQP, I think the endpoint will actually send the reply back to the business application, which will contain the status of the message. The same level that applies for the MQP. For the FSSF, I don't.
The state should be locked as well.
Yeah.
However,
Yes.
Are you interested based on the channel, or is it okay for you that you will see that there are some waiting messages, not based on the channel, but in general?
Our idea is to, how to say, I understand that as long as we are sending a file, if we are using some web services, I understand that the answer is synchronous, no? I understand. We don't need to wait to something to know that the file has been sent, and how to say the response is synchronous. I understand, no?
When you use the send message web service operation, the submit is synchronous. However, the rest of the messaging is asynchronous.
Okay. So that means that if we ask for something in regarding to the status, we don't know what's going, how to say, we need to include some kind of time frame in order to ask what is the status until it is receive the acknowledge that the file has properly received by the ending part. Am I right?
Yeah, there is like no way to get like the let's say given window of message sent and their statuses. You need to pull this information one by one. The way how to pull it then depends on the integrational channel. For the web service specifically, if you know you will need to know the message ID. You can send the check message status request, and it will basically give you back the status document containing the current message status, and also the history of it, so the timestamps where it was delivered, etc. But there is currently no feature that would allow you to get a specific time frame.
Okay. One general comment regarding to that is that we are using on top of that EDX for sending our preliminary processing data and reporting information document and so on. And my understanding of that is that I assume that how to say the way that is configured the ECP, what is the impact on the EDX? So that means that if we need to receive some data from some ECP endpoint outside our company that is sending back files, it is impacting if we are changing something on the ECP in terms of receiving from a third endpoint, let me say, Coreso or something like this, to know how to say, we are in the, let me say, in the risk of having problems with the EDX according to that in terms of configuring the EDX for receiving files from third parties, taking into account that we have configured the ECP from the receiving part on the other side of the chain and so on. We need to take care about the EDX in order to not make any unexpected behavior or EDX regarding to that configuration of ECP, or it is, how to say, or the behavior when we are connecting to some other endpoint outside OPDE, it is, how to say, independent. I would like to know your opinion on that.
Well, that's interesting. Well, generally, if you're using EDX, then it's better probably go like full with EDX and use it for everything. So configure the ECP endpoint just to send the messages to the EDX toolbox. But I'm not sure if I'm getting your idea of the independence there. Like, you could clarify that a bit more?
Yes. For instance, when we are receiving at this moment the reporting information market document, the result from the CMA, okay, we are receiving using using EDX. So that means that EDX toolbox has some paths configured to receive the data on daily basis. So what we would like to know if we are configuring ECP for receiving data outside OPD ecosystem, let me say Coreso, something like this, because Coreso has configured its own ECP endpoint in order to exchange data with our infrastructure. We would like to know if, how to say, how is impacted the EDX if we are doing some changes in the ECP in order to not have any failure in the EDX as long as we are exchanging with third parties the information on ECP. Let me say something like this.
Michael, can take this separately, but to be aligned, if you can give us in more writing, because it's not clear exactly how the setup you're talking about going to work. So if we have more clarity on this, I think that would be good.
Yeah, like the edX obviously cannot be independent from the ECP endpoint. It also always require it. Configuration wise, as I mentioned, if you're already receiving via edX toolbox, I guess also for you it would be easier to use the EDX toolbox for all the messages and then just splitting some part on the ECP or just affecting the ECP itself, because once something wrong goes on the ECP, let's say some configuration mistake that creates an outage, etc., it will also disconnect the EDX toolbox from the other parties. So yeah. Well,
Okay. Okay. I think so that is better to, how to say, to
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
OPD support to send the use case to know how we are dealing with, to, how to say, to share some screenshots according to that, and to know what is your feedback about that in order to not break anything on the EDX configuration that is, how to say, not how to say, we are not going to expect any not expected behavior on EDX, because we have configured the ECP in with bad parameters or something like this. No,
Yeah,
that is
so
my
yes, sorry, Miguel. So that's why I was saying. So it would be more clear if we have more clarity in terms of how the setup is, or means you guys are thinking to set it up, so that we can provide some feedback about it, whether it is good setup, not, or what to do there. So
Thank you so much,
it would
Pushpendra.
be helpful, Miguel. So because right now you're trying to explain, we're trying to understand, but I think it's might
Yes,
be still not clear on those understanding, and then whatever we information we provide might be not sufficient for you as well.
yes.
So
Okay,
that way, I think if we have something little bit detail in the email or somewhere, then it will be helpful to give exactly checking it and then aligning it
thank you
to
so much.
give you a feedback. Okay, I see it's already 45 minutes past the time, and then we have number of attendants already reduced. So let me know if there are any further questions on this today. Otherwise, as I mentioned, we will upload the recording within 1 week on the YouTube, and then you can review or revisit the videos. And do not forget to subscribe or register to the upcoming webinars, which is planned in September, and then one is in November. If that's all, then I would suggest to close this webinar for today. Thank you, Daniel and Mikhail, for the webinar, and we'll see you later.
Yeah, thank you for the
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.